In the bright, air-conditioned September of 2008, the future was being sold off in silence. Not in a war room, not on a battlefield, but behind glass towers, inside conference calls, and across trading floors where the lights never went out. The world still looked normal from the street. Cafés were open, commutes continued, rent was due. But beneath that ordinary surface, the system that promised stability to millions was cracking hour by hour. Most people wouldn't understand it until years later, because the first casualty of 2008 wasn't money, it was certainty. The assumption that if you worked hard, saved, and played by the rules, the future would keep its side of the bargain. The story of 2008 is often told with numbers, billions, trillions, interest rates, bailouts, but numbers don't explain what it felt like when time itself became unreliable, when plans stopped feeling real. When a decade of effort could be erased with a single email, a single phone call, a single "we're restructuring." To understand how 2008 stole the future, you have to start with a simple, terrifying truth that most people didn't want to admit. The prosperity of the 2000s wasn't built on strength, it was built on leverage. It wasn't a house, it was scaffolding, and scaffolding looks solid right up until the moment it collapses. In the years leading up to the crash, the world was drunk on cheap money. Interest rates were low, credit was easy, debt didn't feel like a chain, it felt like a ladder. A mortgage wasn't just a loan, it was a promise. A future you could move into. Home prices rose and then rose again. People began to treat the market like gravity, an invisible force that could only pull in one direction. Banks discovered they could lend to almost anyone because they didn't intend to keep the risk. They would slice the loans into pieces, bundle them, repackage them, and sell them to someone else. This wasn't lending anymore. It was manufacturing. Mortgages became products, risk became an export, and the most dangerous part was that it didn't feel dangerous. It felt sophisticated. It felt modern. It had acronyms, models, and ratings, an entire language designed to make it sound controlled. But behind that language was something simple. A giant machine turning human paychecks into financial fuel. The people buying these products weren't villains in dark rooms. They were pension funds, banks, insurers, institutions responsible for ordinary lives, retirement accounts, university endowments, insurance portfolios. The money of people who never touched Wall Street, whose hands never placed a trade, whose lives would still be hit when the system snapped. And here was the secret. The system wasn't built to withstand fear. Because the entire structure depended on one assumption, that the flow would never stop, that housing prices would never fall everywhere at once, that borrowers would always refinance, that buyers would always arrive, that tomorrow would always be slightly bigger than today. When that assumption broke, everything that looked like wealth turned out to be paper held together by confidence. The first tremors came before the headlines. Delinquencies crept upward. Adjustable rates reset, payments jumped. The quiet math of household budgets began to fail. And when households fail, the failure doesn't stay contained. It spreads outward, first to lenders, then to investors, then to the entire structure built on their belief. By early 2008, the machine was already choking. One by one, firms discovered that the assets on their books were not what they claimed to be. They weren't liquid, they weren't safe, they weren't even clearly priced. The market for them was disappearing, and without a market, your wealth becomes a story you tell yourself. And then came the moment that turned fear into panic. A famous investment bank, one of the old names, one of the pillars, was suddenly in trouble. Not because it had made one bad bet, but because it had made the same bet as everyone else, only bigger. That was the pattern of the era. If you weren't taking the risk, you weren't keeping up. In a boom, caution looks like incompetence. In March 2008, Bear Stearns collapsed into an emergency rescue. The story was framed as a containment, a one-off, a controlled burn, but it wasn't containment. It was an early warning that the fire was inside the walls. If Bear Stearns could fall, so could any of them. And once that thought enters the system begins to die, not from insolvency, but from mistrust, because modern finance doesn't run on cash. It runs on confidence and short-term lending. It runs on people believing you'll be there tomorrow. It runs on the idea that if you hold something today, you can sell it tomorrow. When that belief disappears, even healthy institutions begin to suffocate. It's like oxygen. You don't think about it until it's gone. By September, the pressure was unbearable. On Monday, September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. This was not a small event. Lehman wasn't a startup. It wasn't an experiment. It was a name that had survived wars, depressions, centuries of change, a symbol of permanence, and it vanished in a day. The collapse hit the markets like a gunshot in a quiet room. Suddenly, no one knew what anything was worth. Banks stopped trusting banks. Lending froze. Institutions that relied on short-term funding found themselves cut off from the financial bloodstream. What followed wasn't a recession in the old sense, a slow decline you could adjust to. It was a seizure. A sudden paralysis of the machine that paid salaries, funded businesses, and moved money around the planet. On the surface, most people still went to work. They still bought groceries. They still answered emails, but the foundation had shifted. The invisible structure beneath ordinary life, the credit that kept businesses alive, the loans that kept mortgages afloat, the financing that kept employers hiring, was collapsing silently. And here's what made it so devastating. People didn't lose the future all at once. They lost it in 1,000 quiet ways. A promotion that never came, a job offer that vanished, a mortgage refinance denied. A business loan pulled at the last minute, a pay freeze that became permanent, a contract not renewed, a temporary cut that never returned. This is how futures are stolen in the modern age, not with soldiers but with spreadsheets. As panic spread, governments faced a humiliating reality. The market had become too interconnected to fail cleanly. The institutions were so large and so entangled that letting them fall would have meant pulling the entire economy down with them. Leaders didn't want to rescue banks. They had to, because it wasn't really about saving bankers. It was about saving the plumbing of society, the pipes that delivered wages, payments, credit, and trade. When the plumbing breaks, the whole house floods, so emergency programs were launched. Central banks opened the taps. Bailouts were debated, sold, justified. In the United States, the government pushed through a massive rescue program, TARP, framed as an urgent intervention to prevent collapse. It was presented as a bitter medicine, necessary to keep the patient alive, but while the top of the system was being stabilized, the bottom was beginning to fall apart. Small businesses lost credit lines, companies cut costs. Hiring stopped, layoffs began, and unemployment isn't just a number, it's a chain reaction. When one person loses income, they cut spending. That cuts someone else's income. That forces another business to shrink. The collapse spreads outward through ordinary life like cold through a house with no heating. The cruelest part was that it didn't feel like a dramatic catastrophe. It felt like doors quietly closing. In previous generations, the future was a place you walked toward. In 2008, for millions, it became a place that moved away. The promises people had been building toward, home ownership, stability, retirement, upward mobility, began to feel like a story from an older world. And nowhere was this theft more visible than in the lives of the young, because youth is supposed to be the runway, the starting line, the moment where effort has maximum reward. But after 2008, young people stepped into a world where the ladder had missing rungs. Graduates entered job markets that didn't want them. Careers began with underemployment, work below skill, below pay, below potential. And when your first years are spent surviving instead of building, the loss compounds, missed savings. Missed promotions, missed experience, missed momentum. The economists later gave this a clean name, scarring, but for the people living it, it wasn't scarring, it was confusion. It was watching effort produce less. It was realizing that the calendar kept moving even when life didn't. There's a saying that time is money. In 2008, money became time, lost time, years that never quite paid back. The psychological damage was deeper than the financial damage, because money can return. Confidence is harder. Once you watch the system fail, you begin to see instability everywhere. You begin to save differently, spend differently, plan differently. You shrink your horizon. You become cautious not by personality, but by experience. A generation that should have been optimistic became defensive. A generation that should have been building became guarded. The future stopped feeling guaranteed. It started feeling rented. And in that shift was the real theft, because what 2008 stole wasn't just wealth. It stole the belief that stability was normal. It taught people that safety was conditional. that careers could evaporate, that housing could collapse, that institutions could break and then be rescued, while ordinary households were left to absorb the shock. That was the moment many people learned a brutal rule of the modern world. When systems fail, the pain is not evenly distributed. The crisis exposed a hidden asymmetry. At the top, the system was too important to be allowed to die. At the bottom, failure was treated as personal. A bank could be systemic. A household could be irresponsible. A corporation could be rescued. A worker could be redundant. That language mattered because language decides who gets sympathy and who gets blame. By 2009, unemployment surged and then lingered. In some places, it became a constant presence, a slow drip of anxiety. People didn't just fear losing jobs, they feared not finding one again. That fear changes a society. It makes people accept less. It makes them stay silent longer. It makes them tolerate instability as if it's inevitable. And while the economy eventually recovered on paper, the lived recovery was uneven. Markets rebounded faster than wages. Asset owners regained value faster than workers regained security. If you had stocks, you saw green. If you had a paycheck, you felt the grind. This is another hidden truth of 2008. It didn't end, it transformed. It rewired the meaning of adulthood. It delayed milestones. It pushed marriage, kids, home ownership, stability further down the road. Not because people didn't want those things, but because the conditions that made them possible had shifted. And when milestones delay, time changes. You can't make up for the years you couldn't start. You can only carry them. There's a proverb that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. After 2008, millions realized that the first best time had been stolen, and now felt like catching up. The crisis also created a new kind of work culture, one built on insecurity, hustle culture, side gigs. Always on availability, not because everyone became ambitious, but because stability stopped feeling trustworthy. When the ground can disappear, you start building backup plans, then backups become normal, then normal becomes exhausting. In that sense, 2008 didn't just steal the future, it installed a permanent emergency mindset. And the most ironic part is that from the outside, the world eventually looked fine again. New phones, new apps. New highs in the markets, new buildings, new headlines, but inside people's planning, the quiet mental math that shapes a life, the damage remained. Because once you watch the future get repossessed, you stop treating it like property. You treat it like weather, and this is where the story becomes a story of time, not finance. Before 2008, time felt like a straight road. You made choices, you moved forward. After 2008, time felt like a series of resets. The calendar advanced, but life didn't always follow. People began measuring time not by progress, but by recovery, not by milestones, but by survival. The crisis created a quiet emotional heritage, a lingering sense of decline, a feeling that the best days were behind, a suspicion that every boom had a hidden bill. Because 2008 taught a lesson that doesn't fade. In modern life, the bill always arrives later. The boom years of the 2000s were paid for in the 2010s, in stagnation, in delayed lives, in anxious work, in cautious spending. In a generation that learned to expect instability as the baseline, and that's why the title is true. 2008 didn't just crash markets, it stole futures quietly, legally, statistically, by bending the timeline of ordinary lives. It took what should have been building years and turned them into repair years. It took confidence and replaced it with caution. It took the idea of later and made it feel uncertain. The story of 2008 is often framed as a technical failure, a mispricing of risk, a regulatory gap, a bubble. But at the human level, it was something simpler, a breach of trust between effort and outcome. A society can survive poverty, it can survive hardship. What it struggles to survive is disbelief, the feeling that the rules no longer mean anything. And once disbelief spreads, people don't just lose money, they lose patience. They lose long-term thinking. They lose the willingness to invest in futures they no longer believe are guaranteed. That is the real theft, because the future isn't a place, it's a belief system. And in 2008, that belief system cracked. The markets eventually recovered. Headlines moved on, politicians changed. But the imprint remained inside ordinary lives in delayed milestones, cautious choices, and a quiet sense that stability is never fully owned. The crisis ended on paper, but its shadow extended for years, like a long winter that teaches the body to flinch at cold. The future came back, but it came back different, smaller, more conditional, more expensive, more fragile. And that is why 2008 is not just an economic event. It is a longevity event, a story about how one year can bend the arc of a lifetime, not by shortening life, but by changing what life can become. I'm Karim, and this is Cinematic Longevity. Subscribe if you want stories about time, endurance, and the hidden costs history leaves inside ordinary lives, because when the headlines fade, what remains is how it felt to live through them.
If you enjoyed this, then please subscribe for more.